The auction yard was silent, not because there was nothing to sell, but because no one wanted what sat on the cracked dirt under the noonday sun. A boy, barely 18, shirtless, shoeless, covered in dust and scars that didn't come from accidents. They came from years of being discarded, passed around like cargo, traded and tried like someone could fix what others broke. People looked, people whispered, but no one reached for him. A merchant murmured, "He's feral." A rancher spat, "He ain't worth feeding." Someone laughed, "Leave him for the vultures." The boy didn't flinch, didn't cry, just sat there, head down, elbows on knees, waiting for this moment to end like all the others until a sound. Boots slow, purposeful, not from a buyer's bench, not from the shadows from the road. A tall man in a sun-worn hat, coat trailing dust, eyes hidden beneath a brim so bent it could have told stories. His horse limped behind him, saddle faded, reins loose. The cowboy stepped into the crowd, but he didn't look at the wagons or the crates or the livestock. He looked at the boy straight on like he was the only thing there. "What's the price?" the cowboy asked, voice low but clear. The auctioneer blinked. "Price? Ain't nobody named him. Ain't nobody claimed him." The cowboy nodded once, walked forward, reached into his coat. People chuckled. "You buying him?" "No," said the cowboy. He knelt beside the boy. "I'm taking him." And the crowd shifted. Gasps, murmurs. One man hissed, "That's charity. He'll steal from you." But the cowboy didn't answer them. He said just one thing to the boy, "Get up." The boy looked up for the first time, eyes dark, face sharp, lean like he'd been carved from hunger. But he stood slow, silent, and when he did, the crowd quieted. Because in that moment, even without boots or belonging, the boy didn't look broken. He looked free. And the cowboy handed the auctioneer a few silver coins. Not as payment, as a reminder. "Some things aren't bought," he said. "They're rescued." The boy hadn't said a word. Not when the cowboy handed him a spare hat frayed around the edges. Not when he tossed him a tattered blanket and gestured toward the horse. The saddle was cracked. The leather screamed underweight, but it held them both. Side by side they rode west. The trail was dry, the land endless. Buzzards circled high, watching for stories with endings. For miles the cowboy didn't speak, and the boy didn't ask. But in silence a language built between them, not in words. In how the cowboy didn't look at the boy like he was dangerous or dirty or less. In how he always made camp under shade, even if it meant riding an extra hour. In how he set a plate aside before serving himself. By the third sunset, the boy spoke. "Why me?" The cowboy didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he didn't want to answer wrong. So instead he said, "You remind me of someone." And that was enough for now. That night, under stars too bright to be ignored, the boy stared at the fire. "There was a ranch," he whispered. "Once I cleaned stalls, fed pigs, slept in hay when they let me, got blamed for things I didn't do." He stopped. "They kicked me out with nothing." The cowboy listened, chewing slow, eyes on the flames. "Men like that," he finally said, "think hurting others makes them bigger." The boy nodded. "I fought back once. Good. They broke my ribs." The cowboy didn't flinch, just said, "Still good." Because fighting back means you haven't given up. At dawn, the boy woke to find a set of boots beside him, not new but solid. He looked up. The cowboy was saddling the horse. "You'll ride better in those," he said. And the boy, now standing taller, walking steadier, didn't reply. He just slipped them on. The boots fit. Not perfectly, but enough to feel like tomorrow wasn't a trick. Dry Creek wasn't much of a town. 3 buildings, 1 saloon, a sheriff's office with a single cell, and a general store where the goods cost double unless you had muscle or a badge. The cowboy rode in first. The boy stayed close. People stared. Whispers followed. Is that the broken kid from the auction? What's he doing with him? The cowboy didn't bother to answer. He tied his horse at the post, nodded toward the saloon, and stepped inside. It smelled of whiskey and spit. Music drifted from a rusty piano played by a man who looked half asleep. Behind his bar stood Charlie Riggs, a rough old outlaw turned barkeep missing 2 fingers, but not the fire in his eye. He looked up as the cowboy walked in. Didn't expect you here. Need supplies? Charlie narrowed his eyes. And the kid? The cowboy glanced back at the boy who still lingered outside, scanning every window, like danger grew in shadows. He's with me, the cowboy said. Charlie nodded slow. Then you better know who's watching. He tossed a coin onto the bar. Marshal Ben Crow's on his way. Says the boy's a thief. Says he ran from a ranch near Dust Hollow after attacking a foreman. The cowboy didn't blink. Charlie leaned in. This ain't a place for saints. The cowboy leaned back. Good. I'm no saint. Outside, the boy felt the shift in the air. 2 riders had stopped near the well. Black coats, shiny spurs, the kind of men who smile without kindness. One of them called out, You there, boy. He turned. You got a name? He didn't answer. I heard you got blood on your hands. Still silence. The second rider slid from his horse, stepping forward. You going to come quiet, or do we scrape you off the street? The boy didn't move, but the cowboy did. The saloon doors banged wide and every head turned as he stepped out, coat swinging like it carried a storm. He's not going anywhere, the cowboy said. The first rider sneered. Marshal says otherwise. I don't care what the marshal says, the cowboy growled. The rider grinned. Then maybe it's time you go on trial, too. The next sound was fast. A hand moved, a gun clicked, and the cowboy was quicker. Before the rider could draw, the cowboy fired not at the man, but at the ground in front of him. Dust exploded, horses bucked. The crowd gasped. Next time, the cowboy said coldly, it won't be the ground. That night, the cowboy and the boy slept behind the saloon under canvas and stars. The boy whispered, You shouldn't have stepped in. They'll come after you now. The cowboy shook his head. Son, they were always coming. They rode out a dry creek before dawn. The cowboy said nothing. The boy followed his lead. Each hoof beat on dirt sounded like a warning, like history echoing from somewhere behind them. Miles passed. Hawks glided overhead. The sky widened. And then the boy asked again, You said I remind you of someone. Who? The cowboy glanced over, jaw tight, eyes distant. My brother. The boy blinked. You had a brother? Still do somewhere? What happened? The cowboy pulled his coat tighter like the wind had teeth. He was taken in by a man with land, horses, power, promised him everything, gave him hell. The boy frowned. Did he run? The cowboy shook his head. He stayed. Thought loyalty would save him. It didn't. They made camp near a stream that cut through red rock. The boy watched fish dart through the water, fingers tracing old scars on his arms. They called me Finn once, he said quietly, back before all this. The cowboy looked up. Finn? Yeah, after a river I was found near. I don't remember who named me. The cowboy nodded slowly, as if the name meant something, but he didn't say what. Later, while the boy slept under the stars, the cowboy sat by the fire, staring at a worn letter pulled from his pocket, edges cracked, ink faded, just one line still visible. If you find him, tell him I never blamed him. The signature at the bottom, J. Finn Holloway. Come morning, something had shifted. The cowboy was quieter, the boy sharper. And on the horizon, dust riders, not bandits, deputies. The deputies rode hard. 4 in total, dust-covered, grim-faced, not the kind that asked questions, the kind that brought ropes and stories written in someone else's ink. The cowboy and the boy saw them coming from the ridge. Keep riding, the cowboy said, but don't talk. Just ride. They moved fast through tight hills, ducking beneath stone outcroppings, the horse breathing heavy, muscles straining, but the deputies had newer mounts, faster legs. By dusk, they were boxed in. The cowboy led them into an abandoned mining camp, shacks with broken doors and rusted tools. He dismounted, checked his revolver. 6 rounds. The boy looked around. There's no escape. The cowboy didn't answer. He handed the boy a knife, dull but serviceable. Last line. The boy hesitated. I've never used it only if you must, but use it. They hid in the largest shack, darkness sealing them inside. From the outside, bootsteps approached. Then came the voice. Finn Holloway. You're wanted for assault, theft, and evasion. The boy froze. How do they know my full name? The cowboy's grip tightened. That ranch you were kicked from, Dust Hollow? That foreman you fought? The boy nodded. That man's last name was Crow. The boy's eyes went wide. Marshal Crow? The cowboy exhaled. He's not just enforcing law, he's protecting reputation. His own footsteps circled the shack. We can do this clean, one deputy barked, or we can burn you out. The cowboy stepped outside. Moonlight hit his face, calm, determined. I'm the one who helped him escape, he said, not the boy. Me. The deputies hesitated. One reached for his cuffs and then a scream from behind the shack. One of the deputies had stumbled into an old mine haft. Collapsed timber gave way beneath him. Dust billowed. Chaos broke loose. The cowboy grabbed the boy's arm. Now they ran through stone alleys, past broken carts, into the hills. Gunshots cracked. A bullet grazed the cowboy's arm. He grunted but didn't stop. Eventually, the shots grew distant. They had escaped. Hours later, they sat beside a creek, breath ragged. The cowboy tore cloth from his coat to bind his wound. The boy stared at him. Why did you lie back there? The cowboy met his eyes. To buy time. But you could have been arrested. I've been arrested for less. The boy frowned. You keep doing this for me. Why? The cowboy stirred the fire slowly. Because if someone had done this for my brother, maybe he wouldn't have stayed. The boy swallowed hard. You keep talking about him. Why haven't you tried to find him? I did for years then. I got close once. Saw him at a ranch near Mesa Ridge. He looked happy, strong, had a family. So why didn't you speak? The cowboy looked away, because he didn't look like he remembered me. The night grew quiet. Crickets sang. The boy whispered, I remember someone once. A man who pulled me from a barn fire when I was 5. Never saw him again. He glanced over. I think that was you. The cowboy didn't respond for a long time, then a slow nod. I think it was. The horizon looked like bruised gold when they saw him. One rider alone, slow and sure. He didn't wear dust like others. He wore the badge, and not like it was earned, but like it was owed. Marshal Ben Crow, thick mustache, eyes sharp, a rifle slung tight behind his saddle. He'd been a judge, a rancher, a foreman, and every story attached to him had a trail of bruised bodies and broken promises. The cowboy didn't move. The boy stiffened. That's him. Crow stopped a few feet from their camp. Thought you could outrun me? The cowboy stepped between him and the boy. We weren't running. Crow laughed, slow and bitter. That's good because you're coming with me either way. The cowboy raised an eyebrow. On what charge? Crow slid from his horse. His boots hit the dirt like verdicts. He stole, assaulted a man under my employee, resisted arrest, nearly killed a deputy. The boy stepped forward. That foreman whipped a 12-year-old stable hand unconscious. I tried to stop him. Crow smiled without warmth. You punched him in the jaw with a hammer. That stable hand was stealing, the cowboy said, calm as the wind. And what were you doing while children were beaten under your watch? Crow drew his revolver. This isn't a debate, but the cowboy didn't flinch. You want justice? Crow snorted. Justice is for courts. No, the cowboy said. Justice is for men who tell the truth. The boy held the knife tighter behind his back. He whispered, I'll run. No, the cowboy whispered. Stand. But he'll take me and I'll take him. Crow stepped closer. You really want to die for a kid who doesn't even know his own bloodline? Silence. Then the cowboy said, voice low and measured, he knows enough. He knows pain and loyalty and fight. That makes him more my kin than any name ever written. Crow chuckled. Fine. He aimed the revolver, and then a crack split the air. Not a shot. A whip of wind and a bullet tore through Crow's shoulder from behind. He stumbled, shouting. Two men burst from the brush, rifles raised. One of them yelled, Drop it, Marshal! You don't own justice out here. It was Riggs, the old barkeep, and behind him, Sheriff Delaney from Dry Creek, tired, honest, and finally fed up. Crow froze. Delaney stepped forward. We've heard enough. The boy's story checks out. The ranch, your foreman paid off more silence than he should have. And you've hidden your own messes too long. Crow was cuffed. He raged, fought, called it betrayal. But justice came quietly that day. Not in shots, but in truth exposed. The boy watched him dragged away. I thought he'd win, he said. The cowboy smiled. Men like him always think that. The wind had changed. The air carried less dust now, more silence. The kind that settles after storms when all you hear is what's left behind. They were safe. The law had backed down. The marshal once feared, now cuffed and disgraced. But safety doesn't mean peace. Not always. They camped near a canyon split where thunder used to echo off rock when storms passed through. The boy sat beside the fire, boots scuffed but solid, staring at flame with a furrow that hadn't left his brow since Crow said his name. You knew me, the boy finally said. The cowboy nodded. I didn't just remind you of someone. I was someone. Another nod. The boy's voice cracked, quiet but sharp. So tell me. The cowboy tossed another stick into the fire. Sparks lifted like memories. I was working a ranch along the edge of Dust Hollow just for a season. One morning there was a barn fire. They never found out how it started. He paused. I got a boy out, small, covered in soot, scared beyond words. The boy swallowed me. I left him with the owner, said I'd be back. But when I returned days later, they said he'd vanished, taken by a traitor claiming to be kin. The boy's fists clenched. That traitor wasn't my kin, I know. The night grew deeper. Coyotes howled. The cowboy looked across the fire. I searched years, never found a trail. You stopped? No, he said. The trail stopped. The boy's eyes glistened all this time. I thought no one looked. The cowboy met his gaze. I did. Every mile they sat in silence again. Then the boy asked what had been resting on the edge of every moment. What's your real name? The cowboy hesitated, not from fear, but from weight. Jeremiah Holloway. The boy blinked. I had a brother, Jeremiah said, voice almost a whisper. Name was Finn. The boy stared. You think that's me? He asked. Jeremiah tossed the last ember of doubt into the fire. I don't think, he said softly. I know. They rode back the long way, not because the road was shorter, but because neither of them was ready for the town to be there when they arrived. Jeremiah wanted the dust to settle in them first, to let the memory of being hunted cool into something quieter than fear. Finn kept his gaze on her horizon, trying to map pieces of himself to the ridges and gullies he now recognized. Each landmark made the past tilt and settle in his chest like loose stones finding their place. Dust Hollow sat the same as it had the last time either of them had looked at it through the lens of desperation. A cluster of buildings, sun-baked in stubborn fences that had forgotten how to stand straight. A handful of men who chose to keep power like a religion, but without Crow's smirk threaded through everything. The place felt raw and new. It was easier to see the parts that mattered instead of the shadow he'd been made to live under. They tethered the horse near the edge of town and walked in. Two silhouettes cutting into a place that had once swallowed one of them whole. Finn's steps were small at first, but he grew into them like a man testing boots he'd almost given up for lost. At the ranch, the big house looked emptier than his memory allowed. A younger woman answered a gate. A niece, the man said later. And when Jeremiah gave his name, the muscles in her face tightened with something like recognition, and then swiftly with the kind of politeness that people taught themselves when reputation sat on the scale. You again, she said, not unkind. You were here before. She looked past Jeremiah to Finn. You're the one they sold away. Finn felt his name settle in his mouth. He let it tumble out, not as a question, but as a claim. I'm Finn Holloway. The syllables felt raw and true. They were ushered into the parlor where a ledger lay open on a table, and nearby a crate of old papers. The niece Ruth, she introduced herself, was not blind to how the land had been run. We weren't all for him, she admitted in the hush of the room. There were things, whispers, men who didn't eat right, and children who learned to be small. Ruth produced letters. It was messy, dirt lines on edges, ink gone pale. But one letter was preserved more than the others, folded and refolded. The handwriting familiar to Jeremiah, like the weight of a familiar coin. He recognized the stroke of a certain looped J. He reached out, fingers trembling, and read aloud the line that had never left his coat. If you find him, tell him I never blamed him. Finn watched Jeremiah watch the paper. For a long moment, dust and years, and the ache of all that searching closed around them like a held breath. Then Jeremiah laughed. Not the hard bark he used for threats, but something small and astonished. You wrote that? Finn asked. Because the face in the letter could have been anyone's, and because the mind still prefers certainty to the ache of guessing. Jeremiah nodded. I did. I thought I was writing to a boy I had lost. I didn't know you'd be the one reading it. Finn's shoulders loosened. The name was his. Yes, and the shape of him was finally named too, not by a traitor or a foreman, but by a man who had carried his memory for years. You came back for me, he said, the sentence fragile as a new bone. I came back for me, Jeremiah corrected gently. For a chance I couldn't take the first time, I thought. He stopped because sometimes sentences are tools blunt enough to do damage. I thought if I found you and if you were okay, maybe I could forgive myself for not being there. Forgiveness, Finn learned in the coming days, was not a single act. It was a bunch of small, stubborn gestures. Jeremiah sat with him while he slept. He traded stories for chores and let Finn do the jobs he could. Mending a fence, coaxing a stubborn foal, stacking hay until his arms ached, not from hunger, but from purpose. When Finn flinched at the clang of a hammer or the bark of a dog, Jeremiah's hand was there on his shoulder like an anchor. When a neighbor, a man who'd once nodded at Crow's judgments, spat on the ground and called Finn a thief, Jeremiah moved in front of him and told the truth, slow and sharp as a plow. Words seeped through dust, hollow and beyond. Crow's arrest, the way his men had been exposed, made room for people who had been careful about hope to try it on. It wasn't grand. No parades, no receipts of repentance laid out on the table, but it made a difference. A barn was repaired, and then another. A woman in Dry Creek brought a pot of stew and left it on Jeremiah's porch without fanfare. Charlie Riggs, when he rode through to check on them, clapped Finn on the back like he'd always been meant to. There were nights Finn still woke with the taste of smoke in his mouth, hands wanting to crawl into the smallness of being invisible. But each morning he learned to breathe into belonging. He started to ask questions about the things most boys were never taught to ask. The difference between fear and caution, when to run and when to stand, how to put a name into the world and make it stick. Jeremiah, for his part, found the ghost he'd been chasing had its own life. Now it wasn't the boy who had been taken from the world, but a man who had been remade by years apart. That realization altered not so much his craving for what had been, but his appetite for what could be. He wanted to teach Finn how to hold a rope, how to read the river's mood, how to fix a leather saddle so it would not cry when weight found it. He wanted to be useless in a way that meant safety, the kind of uselessness that comes from having given everything in the past and now being content to give the small, steady things in time and in small, stubborn increments that do justice to the long work of healing. They turned a corner toward a life neither had been born into, but which both could learn to love. Finn took on a name and a place to sleep, and a horse that liked him. Jeremiah, who once had a map of every town with a red X where lost lived, crossed out an old mark and set a new one. A shelter, if it wasn't ambitious to call it that, a place where boys no one wanted could find a bed, and someone who would not auction them off when the wind turned. The land, which had seemed like a ledger of debts, became a ledger of small credits. There were potlucks and bad piano nights at the saloon that smelled of tobacco, but hosted too many good jokes to ever be truly ugly. Delaney paid his visits and left with a nod. Charlie kept the stories coming. Little legends that had nothing to do with Crow and everything to do with the funny things horses do at dawn. One autumn evening, with the kind of light that softens edges and makes memory feel like forgiveness, Finn asked Jeremiah a question that had not been for blame, but for belonging. "Do you think I should stay?" he asked, watching the sun spill gold across the corral. Jeremiah rested his hand on Finn's shoulder, the same hand that had steadied him when the deputies came, the same hand that had written a letter and folded it like hope. "I don't know what fate says," he replied, "but I know what I want. I want you here, and if you want here, too, then we build." Finn thought of the auction yard, of the cracked dirt, and the sound of men treating people like property. He thought of the hat Jeremiah had put on his head the first day, and the stubborn, slow kindness that had come with every meal set aside. He thought of the nights when the only way to stop shaking was to work, and of the mornings when the only way to stop hurting was to laugh. Build, Finn said, and the single word felt like a covenant. They did. They built fences and routines and a little patch of garden that stubbornly refused to die. They took in another boy one winter who'd been laughed out of town and taught him, as Jeremiah had taught Finn, that being trusted is better than being feared. In time, they opened their doors to others who needed a hand that didn't measure them by money or paper or the weight of a crooked badge. The place became a patchwork of ragged lives, stitched with a kind of care that leaves no ledger. Years later, Finn would stand on a rise and look down at a homestead that had once been the shape of his worst days, and now was the shape of every small necessary mercy they had made. Jeremiah would be in the yard whistling at a dog and carrying a plank, hair silver at the temple but steady in his hands. They would argue softly with the familiarity of people who love each other enough to be honest about the best way to break a cult or mend a fence. They would tell stories until the torchlight blurred into the mouths of the children gathered around them. And when the wind came to remind them of how things had been, they would smile because they had chosen differently. And on quiet nights when the world felt like an honest thing, Finn would take the old hat from its nail, press it to his face, and remember an auction yard and a man who stepped out of the dust and into a place where rescue was more than a moment. It was a life lived day by day in work and in waiting and in the stubborn, ordinary mercies that make up the story of